I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. When everybody's perfect, what happens to everybody else? Bill, Chinese scientist, as you may have read, has been doing some tweaking of the genetic code of human beings, editing the DNA using CRISPR technology, and took it a step further than most scientists have so far by actually implanting these genetically modified embryos into the womb in order to facilitate gestation and continue it and bring them to term. This has created an uproar in the scientific community, and there is a column in the New York Post by a Mark Thiessen, Thiessen, that brought up an interesting point. I want to get your take on this, Bill. If children eventually are perfectible, no disease, smart, handsome, free of defects, won't failure to modify your children genetically become so unpopular because those children effectively could become a burden on society that it will almost become mandatory for you to modify your genetic code so that the children come out just right?
Well, my first take on this is you can get a lot of interesting science done if you live in a communist dictatorship. Not good science, but interesting science. And my second thought is this isn't really breaking news for China because China's been doing genetic modification of children for thousands of years. And the way that works is that children born with two Y chromosomes, two X chromosomes. I'm off my game. Two X chromosomes are throughout the history of China pretty much left on a mountaintop because girls just weren't really that desired in Chinese society. So they have a bit of a habit of doing this. You can't just blithely say it's absolutely wrong, because the idea of having research that would free you from birth defects, the kind of research that may determine that cancer simply is just not genetically possible anymore. Cancer's gone. Cancer deaths are gone. Those kind of things are exceedingly desirable, but the problem is that they seem to be interminably enmeshed with a lot of things that are not desirable. And they're not desirable from a moral point of view, and that's why I think so many progressives love it and why so many conservatives fear it. It's very difficult on first glance to not make an argument for super people. I mean, you really have to basically be prepared to put yourself in a position where you're willing to say, as I'm willing to say, that the idea of super people brings many benefits in much the same way that real, genuine, self-aware artificial intelligence would as well. Artificial intelligence, many orders of magnitude smarter than us, would bring a bunch of benefits, but in some cases, the moral risk is and the physical risk is too high. And here's where the risk from making perfect babies comes from, Scott. Again, I'm setting aside the ability to prevent diseases and hereditable diseases and that kind of thing. But I'm talking about designer children now. I'm talking about designing their height, designing their eye color, hair color, intelligence, all the rest of it. Everybody else in the world would look like me, and that would really be embarrassing after all. No, but seriously, here's the problem. And I know this may sound like a trivial way to describe the problem, but it is the best example that I've found. There is, in fact, an analog for designing perfect people. And that analog is in role-playing games. It used to be board games, now it's computer games. And in a role-playing game, you would, when you create your character, you would roll a dice, and I was playing Traveler, which was a 12-sided dice system. So basically, you'd roll a dice, and you would have education, intelligence, constitution, your physical health, strength, and you'd get anything on a scale from 2 to 12, because that's what 2 dice will grant you, 2 to 12. And so the higher the number was, the more ability you had to do things in the game. If you had a higher intelligence score, you could solve problems more easily and so on. It gave you a lot of advantages, same for strength and so on. And so needless to say, every single player always wants 12s in everything. They want it to be F, 12s across the board. And here's the problem with that. It's exceedingly boring, and it's boring for the reason that I'm trying to get at here. When the game designers would put together the instructions for creating your own person, making your own person, they would say things that I thought were exceedingly interesting and actually quite profound. They'd say, if you find a huge discrepancy or a huge weakness, make that work for you. In other words, if you have a character who rolls out an intelligence of 12, but an education of 2, make that make sense. Here's a person who's exceedingly bright and didn't have a chance to go to school. What limitations would a very, very poor education have on a person who is exceedingly intelligent? What if you had a character who is exceedingly weak, but very, very agile? Again, and what I suspect happens, and the reason I bring this up is because what makes people excel is their ability to overcome their 2s and 3s and 4s. That's what makes life not only interesting, but makes life extraordinary. There is no question that if everybody were born with perfect scores in every category, that the human race in general would get out of a lot of pathologies that it has already. But we don't know what new pathologies it would get into, and I suspect that's a whole other subject. But basically, it seems to me, Scott, that the entire human experience, not just in terms of creativity, not just in terms of heroism, not just in terms of just the human experience, is a result of us succeeding or failing in trying to overcome our weaknesses and play our strengths. And the ability to eliminate weaknesses, I think, brings with it pretty much the certain guarantee of exceptionalism and genius, both of which, great genius and great evil, both of which you could make a pretty compelling case for the fact that they're both birth defects.
When everybody's special, nobody's special. Bill, let me ask you specifically about disease, because that's what this Chinese scientist is doing. He's created these embryos that are allegedly immune to HIV, okay? Mm-hmm. So let me just follow this thought experiment a little bit with you. Let's say we have the ability to create children who won't get most of the diseases or all of the diseases that we're well aware of. Then, if you don't get this kind of treatment and bring children into the world who are vulnerable to those diseases, you're actually harming society. So therefore, at a certain point, the government not only encourages you to get this done, but mandates you to get this done.
Sure,
and then you say, well, I can't afford to get this done because it costs like what a new car costs or something, at which case, you know what happens. Obamacare for CRISPR gene editing. Mm-hmm. And how do you can't uninvent something. Okay, the technology exists. You can't
Correct.
uninvent it. How do you prevent it from running full steam into disaster and creating an even more dystopian future than we already anticipate?
The great thing about this show, Scott, especially with the questions you pick, is, and you and I have discussed this backstage many times, is that there are so many of these questions and issues that you bring up that I've not given any thought to, and that simply force us to rely on our principles, that force us to go back to our core beliefs. So to answer your question about the desirability of getting rid of illness versus the dangers of designer children, I think the answer should be something along these lines. I don't think you should be able to interfere with the enormous genetic dice roll that is conception, and furthermore, it may not be a dice roll. There are many people, and I myself am among them, I think that there are bigger forces at work other than just 1 in 8 trillion possible combinations of chromosomes and so on. So my answer to this, at least on the fly, would be this. I would be opposed to any kind of a medical procedure that influenced the genes prior to conception. I would let conception happen on its own. And conception happening on its own would preserve the essence of what humanity is, and we would not become an army of incredibly good-looking, incredibly smart, incredibly boring clones.
And if you do it upstream, however, like you're saying, don't do. If you do it upstream, then you actually have affected that DNA strand throughout the generations.
Well, but then that becomes a problem for the next generation's conception, not for scientists.
Yeah.
So And when you consider the total number of possible combinations, is a pretty good guess. So if I had to come back to my moral desires to avoid a world of man-made horrors, and at the same time, my strong desire to use medicine and the hard work and the intelligence of our species over thousands of years to improve the quality of everybody's life, this is probably where I would have to draw the line. I would say that I would be opposed to any technologies that modify preconception DNA state. However, once that child has been conceived or born or whatever, if you can then come up with therapies that can remove things like cancer without affecting the overall fundamental essence of that personality, if you want to get into scientific terms, you could say they're 1 in 8 trillion uniqueness, or you could say their soul, whichever is more appealing to you.
Now, you said you would be opposed to it, Bill, but my question really goes further than that and says, okay, well, who cares what Bill Whittle is opposed to? Who's going to do something to stop it? Who should
Nobody's
do that?
Nobody's going to do anything to stop it. And it's the same thing with artificial intelligence, Scott. When you talk to artificial intelligence scientists, they will tell you that the development of a computer that is smarter than a human is the last invention. And they're absolutely right. It's the last invention. Anything after that is done by machines because they're done better by machines. What's the point of designing a building when artificial intelligence will design it 1,000, they'll make 10,000 copies of a much better building. You just pick the ones you want. And eventually they'll pick the ones they want. So there's nothing you can do, I think, to stop these technologies. On some level, all scientific knowledge is the genie out of the bottle. You can't unlearn how to make nuclear weapons. What you can do is you can come to a world where, and this is the part that I find actually kind of interesting. Let's take nuclear weapons as an example of a technology that is needless to say, potentially extraordinarily dangerous and destructive. But at the same time, Scott, you can make a fairly compelling case, and I've done it before, that the reason that we haven't had any civilizational threatening wars since 1945 is because the addition of nuclear weapons to the idea of warfare has made large-scale warfare essentially unthinkable. It has made it obsolete. If we were to go to a full-scale nuclear war with China, for example, we'd be bombing our factories and they'd be bombing their factories. And it really, on some level, has made those kind of struggles quite obsolete. That's not to say that I don't think there's going to be a tactical exchange, or a rogue missile, or Iran or Pakistan or whatever. But large, full-scale civilizational war, it's us or the Germans, us or the Japanese, that kind of thing. I think those days are made obsolete by the presence of nuclear weapons. And here's my point. The reason that kind of war, I think, is made obsolete by nuclear weapons is because nuclear weapons have so much built-in dread and horror. There's something so fundamentally inhuman about them that we have modified our behavior as a species. We have modified our targeting solution on whether or not to go to war. And somebody, I think it was some science fiction writer, put it much more concisely. They said the reason nuclear weapons have changed wars is because the people that make the political decision to go to war are now the first targets in the war, not just the young men that are being sent overseas. Oh, well, we lost 100 million guys, or we lost, 16,000 killed on the morning of the Somme on July 1st, 1916. Bad show, spot of bad luck there. Now when the generals are being targeted and the president and the kings and everybody else is the primary target, and when the result is the ruin of your society, it changes the fundamental equation of warfare.
Well, let me try another analogy.
But let me just wrap. Sorry. So the reason that seems to have worked as a deterrent is because there's been I think the key point. There's been so much stuff done by non-scientists and non-soldiers. There's been so much of a picture painted by writers, filmmakers, actors. There's been so many searingly effective methods of demonstrating the consequences of war in the nuclear age that we have culturally sucked up this fundamental genetic almost kind of abhorrence of it. And you don't have to look at recent things like, The Day After or anything like that, or Threads, or you can go back to Twilight Zone episodes, and you've got Burgess Meredith, who finally has enough time to read all the books in the world because there's nothing left, and his glasses break, and you realize this is not a world that I want to live in. And we've been growing up with those messages. So when the pop culture is able to bring to the front of our consciousness the potential horrors of these kind of things, then I think our only hope is to willingly abstain from them.
So if you want to look at it this way, and every analogy breaks down and usually breaks down more rapidly when it's coming out of my mouth, but let's just say that the human DNA is a bit of open source software, okay? And it's being modified all over the place, usually not very intentionally, but it is being modified, okay?
That's a reasonable model.
With every interaction. Nowadays. And somewhere way back, almighty Linus Torvald created the initial kernel, and then from there we've spun it off into various versions of our own Linux, okay? Here's what I see coming with this CRISPR technology and this Chinese scientist, and why this can be so scary is because at some point, some people are going to say, you know what? We've got our own version of humanity that you really ought to buy, Bill Whittle. I know you and your lovely bride would like to have children. Your Microsoft baby is going to be the best baby operating system that you could hope for. Meanwhile, somebody else is going, you really ought to consider the Apple baby, because the Apple baby has this other combination of traits and genetic code modifications and stuff like that. And I don't see a way out of this without, it sounds terrible, but I'm like the guy who's in favor of Wild West capitalism going, gee, is this a situation where the government needs to step in and say, wait a minute, the human genetic code is a common property. It is a common good, and it must be regulated at the global levels, let's say.
Well, we've tried regulating things at the global level, and we can't regulate things at the local level. So the idea of regulating this stuff is just not going to happen. There's going to be laboratories in China and other places, and there may be laboratories in the United States. I suspect more likely they belong to Google than they do to the U.S. government. But there are certainly a large number of our current elites who believe that this idea of Homo sapiens as we exist now is a transitory stage into which superhumanity will step. Maybe it's wishful thinking, and maybe this is a chimp who's got a really clever idea about how to escape from the research facility by throwing a banana on the floor. But nevertheless, you said you're going to have the appeal of a Microsoft baby or the appeal of an Apple baby. Scott, I've used Microsoft products and I've used Apple software, and I don't want a people made by either of these two companies. I don't want my kid to be up at bat and have it be full count bottom of the ninth and have the blue screen of death appear, or the spinning pinwheel of and I know it sounds funny, but I'm serious. The idea that humans have the wisdom to be able to make these decisions assumes that there is no such thing as the law of unintended consequences. And this assumption is assumption that seems to be pretty much, speaking of genes, is genetically built into our nature. The idea that I'm going to change this thing because this thing is bad and this is good, and I'm going to turn up the good here, I'm going to turn the suck down over here, and everything will be fine. And the idea that the most complex thing that we're aware of, which is intelligent life, is suddenly going to behave according to these two dials that we've decided to switch in certain frequencies, is exceedingly naive. Now, the real problem here, Scott, is that scientists who are unspeakably brilliant happen to be among the most naive people I've ever met, ever. And it goes on and on and on. Just so that people have two clear examples. When we were sending out messages, the SETI message, and there's one on Voyager, this little gold disc, which obviously will never be found. It's for our own benefit, the Voyager disc. But prior to that, we sent out a radio signal from the Arecibo telescope. We sent it out pretty loud. It was a coded system on who we are and how to find us and so on. And that went out wide. And a number of scientists fairly recently said, maybe we should give this some second thought before we start broadcasting our address, because we don't know who might come calling. And that individual scientist was absolutely eviscerated by the scientific community that said that obviously any intelligent society is going to be peaceful. I mean, obviously. And I remember I remember thinking, like, how can you possibly know that? How can you possibly know that? Surely you're a scientist. Surely you understand that mammals have a limbic system. They have an emotional substrata that sits on top of our reptile brain and below our cerebral cortex and provides things like love, warmth, empathy, loyalty, courage, trustworthiness, all of this. How can you possibly say that, oh, yes, absolutely, everybody will have it? It's just madness. It's insanity. And this is where science has to be guided by philosophy and morality, and essentially, when it comes right down to it, as I said earlier, Scott, by storytelling. Scientists are too smart to see what's right in front of their noses in terms of the potential dangers of some of these things. And just because you're aware of the dangers and you think that the dangers need to be paid attention to, that does not make you a Luddite, doesn't make you a Neanderthal, and it doesn't make you anti-science. On the contrary, it makes you far more scientific because you are now considering possibilities that had not been considered within the confines of this experimental little test tube before. And now we have to deal with the rest of it. I don't think it's going to be possible to say, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to make artificial intelligence. No, we're not going to genetically modify people. I don't think there's a way to stop that. I think what we have to do is we have to be prepared for having the consequences of this be. I think our only hope, Scotty, is that if we, and let me rephrase that, when we enact these technologies, my hope is that whatever horrors and terrors and nightmares they produce will be produced quickly enough so that we can reverse course and have our fingers burned by the lesson. I think that's the only thing that would actually genuinely restrict these kind of technologies.
Well, 5 days a week, Bill Whittle is here on Bill Whittle Now, turning up the wisdom knob and turning down the suck as much as possible.
You got a lot of suck to filter out.
Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your contribution to this enterprise by just watching it right now, by sharing it with other people, and especially to those people who are members at BillWhittle.com who pay $9.95 a month to actually participate in this. They are the citizen producers who are creating and distributing this content around the world. We're grateful to them, and we encourage you to become one of them by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that subscribe link. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.